is Divya Pradhan, and we are going to today talk about the stomach. After the short esophagus, the GI tract expands to form the stomach, which can be thought about or thought of as a temporary storage tank. Here, some amount of chemical breakdown of the food takes place, but the most important of all is that the food is actually physically broken down. So chemical breakdown not only takes place here, but I'm also talking about a little bit of physical breakdown takes place. A tad bit of absorption also starts here. It lies in the upper left quadrant of the peritoneal cavity and is about 15 to 25 centimeters long. But the most interesting thing about the stomach is that its diameter and volume depends upon how much food it contains. When full, it can actually hold about 4 liters of food and can extend all the way up to the pelvis. There are 3 major regions of the stomach. There is of course, the cardiac part, which is near the heart, and the other part, and is surrounded, the cardiac part is surrounded by an orifice through which the food actually enters the stomach. Here is the fundus, which is actually extends above the esophagus right here. There's the body, the main part of the stomach, and then finally is the pylorus right here, pyloric end, which enters, and through here the food enters into the duodenum, and the entrance of which is protected, is controlled by a sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. So the stomach walls contains the 4 layers that are typical for most of the alimentary canal. But its muscularis and mucosa are slightly different. So apart from the usual circular and the longitudinal fibers, some part of the muscle also contain oblique fibers. And this will allow the stomach to mix, churn, and move the food along the tract. Not only the usual stuff, but it will also physically pummel or physically break it down into small fragments. Another interesting term in relationship to stomach is rugae. Rugae, right here as you can see, are these thick folds of mucosal and submucosal lining, and these flatten out when the stomach is distended. Let's look at the next slide. The inner lining of the stomach is that of simple columnar cells, primarily the mucous cells. The smooth lining of the stomach has very deep gastric pits, and these are lined by gastric glands that produce the stomach secretion, which is called gastric juice. The glands are made up of different cells. First, mucous cells, which secrete a cloudy 2-layer coat of alkaline mucus. The parietal cells secrete the hydrochloric acid, the HCl. The acid makes the stomach contents acidic. The pH of the stomach is about 1.5 to about 3.5, and this condition is very much needed and required by the pepsin enzyme found in the stomach. Pepsin. The chief cells occur in the basal portion. These cuboidal cells produce pepsinogen. This is the pepsin, but in an inactive form. Okay, we'll talk about this much more later. And then there are the enteroendocrine cells found deep in the gastric pits, which release chemical messengers. Some of these chemical messengers act locally, such as histamine and serotonin. But the others not only act locally, but also influence other digestive target organs. For example, gastrin, you can barely see it out here. Gastrin is produced by a special type of enteroendocrine cells called the G cells. We'll talk about what gastrin hormone does. Remember, this is gastrin is a hormone, stomach hormone. All right. The stomach mucosa is exposed to some of the harshest conditions in the body. The gastric juice is very corrosive. It has a very low pH. Remember, we said the pH of almost 1.5 at times. But also there is the protein digesting enzyme pepsin, which, remember, can digest the stomach itself. But the question is the stomach a passive victim? No, it's not. It protects itself by producing a barrier. So let's look at the barrier. There's a thick coating of bicarbonate-rich mucus, 2 layers of mucus. The epithelial cells are joined by tight junctions so that the acid, it will not allow the acid to permeate through, to pass through. The mucosal cells are replaced very, very quickly. Almost in 3 to 5 days or 3 to 6 days, the mucosal cells are renewed. However, anything that passes through this barrier is going to result in an inflammation called gastritis, which if it continues, you end up getting ulcers. For a long time, people blamed ulcers on some things like spicy food, smoking, coffee, alcohol, stretch, etc., etc. But now it's known that 90% of the ulcers is because of a bacteria, an acid-resistant bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. This is the scientific name. So if once you doctors determine that you have ulcers caused by, now not all ulcers are because of the bacteria, okay, so careful. Most of the time, ulcers end up a result of the action of this bacteria. You also have to get tested. Once you know that you have an excess amount of Helicobacter pylori causing ulcers, then of course antibiotic is the best route to take. All right. What are the functions of gastric juice components? The first, enzyme. Remember, enzyme is not the same thing as hormone. Okay? The chief cells produce inactive pepsinogen. And this is important. Why is it important? Because remember, pepsin digests protein. It will digest the stomach lining. So here what it is look at the beauty of natural selection and Mother Nature, is it will produce pepsin in an inactive form, pepsinogen. So when you have food and you require to digest the food, pepsinogen, inactive form, can be converted to an active pepsin form. When there's no food, then you continue to produce little bit of pepsinogen. It's inactive. It's harmless. It's not going to digest any protein and therefore not your stomach walls. In children, of course, in infants, of course, there is another enzyme called renin, which coagulates milk protein and gives the milk a very sour look, a curdled look. Then, of course, there's the mucus cells, mucus produced by the mucous membrane, and it produces an alkaline mucus coat. We talked about this. Gastric lipases. Now, lipase digest fat. We all know that. Fat is digested to fatty acid and glycerol. We know this. Now here's the problem. My pen is acting up and I am so sorry. The problem is fat, a big chunk of fat. Remember, the enzyme is water soluble, so it can act only on the surface. Fat is not water soluble. So fat has to be emulsified. If you want to digest fat, you have to emulsify it. Emulsify means I have to just break it into smaller pieces, particles. Okay, this is emulsification. We are in the stomach right here. And who does this emulsification? This is done by bile salts. We are in the stomach. There are no bile salts here. Bile salts are going to come from the liver into the duodenum. We are in the stomach. So of course what happens is very little of any fat digestion takes place, because remember, fat is a large big molecule. You have to emulsify it first. For this action to take place, little bit of lipase acts on the surface of fats and little bit of fat digestion takes place in the stomach. Don't worry, fat is going to be digested later on, so you don't have to worry about the fat. Okay? Stomach lipases, like I said, has weak activity, and the very important factor called intrinsic factor is produced by the parietal cells, which is required for vitamin B12 absorption in the small intestine. In its absence, if you do not produce enough intrinsic factor, B12 will not be absorbed, and therefore the person ends up having pernicious anemia. All right, let's look at the functions of hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid primarily activates pepsin. Like we talked about, pepsin is produced in an inactive form, pepsinogen. Okay? And lingual lipase too. Another function is it breaks up connective tissues and plant cell walls so that it liquefies food. Another function is it liquefies food to form chyme. It converts ingested ferric ions to ferrous ions. And here's the most interesting thing. It destroys ingested bacteria and pathogens. So ingested bacteria and pathogens which have been unknowingly taken by you are going to be destroyed in the stomach. Now this does not mean that you stop washing your fruits and vegetables. You definitely need to wash your fruits and vegetables. But again, look at the beauty of nature. So if anything has escaped and gone into the stomach, it's going to get destroyed. Another thing that I forgot to add on this slide is the hydrochloric acid, remember, opens up proteins. It unfolds proteins. So what are proteins? Proteins are highly folded structures of amino acid chains, okay? So what does acid do? Acid is going to unfold this long chain of amino acids. So now pepsin can work on this protein and break it up into smaller chains of amino acids or individual amino acids, either way, okay? So like you can see right here, the pepsinogen, again the chief cells are producing the zymogen. Zymogen means inactive form. The pepsinogen is produced in an inactive form until and unless it is activated by hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is going to activate it, convert it into active form. The active form is now going to break down proteins, which are basically long chains of amino acid, into either smaller chains of amino acid or individual amino acids, as you can see. All right. What are the phases of gastric secretion? There are three phases: cephalic phase, gastric phase, intestinal phase. Cephalic phase, is also called the reflex phase, and for a reason. And this is the reason is that this will occur before food enters the stomach. It is stimulated by the parasympathetic nerve impulses, and it is generated mostly because of taste, smell, sight, or even thought of the food. So why is this phase necessary? It's getting the stomach ready for the upcoming chore. Okay? The next phase is the gastric phase. Once the food enters the stomach, the local, neural, and hormonal mechanism initiates gastric phase. The most important stimuli are the presence of peptides. So presence of food or peptides and distension of the stomach walls, that means the stretching of the stomach walls, will trigger this, as well as low acidity will trigger the gastric phase. Now the hormone gastrin, this is where it comes in. Gastrin is a hormone, remember, plays the most important role. what it will do is stimulate the release of the enzyme. Which enzyme are we talking about? We are talking about the pepsinogen. So it will do two things. So gastrin will do two things. It will stimulate gastrin. Gastrin will stimulate pepsinogen, the enzyme, but will also stimulate the secretion of hydrochloric acid. My pen is just acting up. HCl. Now, highly acidic conditions, however, when the stomach becomes highly acidic, HCl, then remember it will inhibit gastrin secretion. Okay? When the stomach has high pH, it will stimulate gastrin secretion. Very interesting, very, very interesting. So when protein-rich foods enter the stomach, of course, the pH of the gastric contents will increase, like I said, right? So food has entered, protein-rich food has entered, pH will go up. So what will happen? You want to digest the protein. So what do? It will stimulate gastrin secretion, which will stimulate pepsinogen. Remember, pepsinogen, inactive form, pepsin, active form, and will also stimulate hydrochloric acid. So hydrochloric acid will break down pepsinogen to pepsin, and then finally digestion of the proteins will take place. As protein is digested, the gastric contents become acidic, right? Which will now inhibit gastrin secretion. You don't want the gastrin, excessive amount of gastrin, because gastrin will stimulate pepsinogen, and you don't want pepsin when you don't have food. So this negative feedback maintains optimal pH. Don't worry if you still haven't gotten it, because the next slide I'll explain it again. Okay? The next phase is the intestinal phase, which begins as food leaves the stomach and enters the small intestine, and has two phases. So intestinal phase has two phases. One is the stimulatory phase, and one is the inhibitory phase. Okay? The stimulatory or the excitatory phase starts when food first enters and contacts the duodenum of the initial intestinal walls. This stimulates intestinal walls to produce intestinal gastrin that increases gastric juice secretion. So remember, when the food is entering the duodenum, is just starting to enter the duodenum, that means there's more and more food in the what? In the stomach. So you want to stimulate gastrin. Okay. But then as more and more food enters the intestine, the inhibitory phase starts. The inhibitory phase starts as soon as the small intestine starts filling with irritating substances, especially large amount of what? Hydrogen ions from the stomach are coming. So here's the stomach, here's the intestine. Food is now entering, not only entering, but now what happens is stretching the duodenum walls. And therefore what happens is if the hydrogen ions enter and remain there, it is not going to allow the enzymes of the duodenum small intestine to work, because the intestines of the duodenum as well as in the small intestine require higher pH. So a break is necessary. And how is this break created? This break is created by a reflex called enterogastric reflex, which is triggered by presence of acid in the upper part of small intestine, which inhibits gastric juice secretion. You have to inhibit the gastric juice secretion, which includes HCl, pepsin, etc., etc. In addition, two hormones are released by the intestine, the cholecystokinin and intestinal somatostatin. Very, very important. Cholecystokinin is a hormone that is stimulated by protein and fats in the small intestine, and what it does is it will decrease gastric motility. Somatostatin is stimulated by fat and will decrease gastric juice secretion, period, done. You don't want gastric juice secretion when the food has already come out of the stomach and is in the intestine. So the same enterogastric reflex repeated. When the duodenum fills up with chyme, stimulatory sensory stretch receptors are stimulated. The stretch receptors are stimulated because food is entered here. This will stimulate what? The enterogastric reflex. What will this do? This will send messages, impulses are sent to the central nervous system, and as a result, lesser and fewer parasympathetic impulses reach the stomach. So now, what happens is, both motility and secretion will stop. See, peristalsis stops, secretion stops, okay? And secretion of gastric juices stops. Plus, so not only is parasympathetic important, there's a break in parasympathetic impulses, but these two hormones, remember, cholecystokinin and somatostatin, will inhibit peristalsis and gastric juice secretion. We talked about that before, yes? And this will slow down intestinal filling, regulate the rate at which chyme enters the small intestine, and will now depress or decrease stomach activity. It's no longer required. Food is already in the duodenum. Now let's look at the stomach mixing and emptying. The stomach exhibits a wave-like contraction called peristalsis or peristaltic wave. Both are correct. After a meal, it begins near the gastroesophageal sphincter, right here. Okay? And what does it do? It is going to produce a rippling action, and the chyme is pushed where? Towards the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter, in turn, remember right here, slightly relaxes. Excuse me. And small amount, very little amount of chyme, which is mostly liquid or small molecules only, are pushed through the sphincter into the duodenum. So what happens? Most of the chyme is now pushed back. And this will allow, what will it allow? It will allow mixing and plummeting and breaking down of the food into small pieces. So here what happens is when the food is being pushed back, just remember this sphincter, it's important, remains closed. If this sphincter does not close well, some amount of the acidic content goes up the esophagus, and you end up with acidic reflux. Okay? Once the mixing has taken place, now when does emptying start? Emptying starts 4 meals after meal. After a meal. So more its fluid content, the faster it will empty. Larger the meal, larger and more fluid is content, it will empty fast. But remember, if there's more fat content, then the emptying will be slow. And this is why when you eat a very fatty food, fat-rich food, remember you remain full for a long time. You don't feel like eating afterwards, okay? It's because the emptying is going to be very slow. And for a reason, we know the reason. Lipid digestion is very little and very slow in the stomach, okay? Control of gastric secretion. Okay, it depends upon both neural as well as hormonal. Neural means it has to do with nerves. So who are the nerves? Remember, you are resting and digesting, so parasympathetic nerves are the ones that are going to be very active. So when parasympathetic nerve fibers in the vagus stimulate the stomach, the secretory activity increases. When sympathetic, in contrast, when sympathetic nerves or system is excited, is stimulated, then it will depress gastric activity, right? You don't want to, this is responsible for flee or flight. You don't want to sit and digest in there. Hormonal control is by, of course, remember we talked about gastrin, right? Which stimulates both. Remember, it stimulates pepsin or pepsinogen secretion and the acid secretion, right? We talked about this. All right, next slide. Absorption in the stomach, very, very limited. There's some amount of water and salts and some lipid-soluble drugs, and that's why most of the pharmaceutical companies want to make drugs that are lipid-soluble. So fast absorption, fast acting as soon as you intake it and it goes into the stomach. And of course, alcohol is absorbed in the stomach. So you take alcohol in an empty stomach, you get tipsy faster. That's no reason, by the way, for drinking. Vomiting reflex. Vomiting reflex is the rapid emptying of the stomach in the reverse direction. What happens? Extreme distension of the stomach. It's either because of extreme distension or because of intestinal irritants such as drugs, toxins, or it could be rapid change in body motion. We'll talk about that, okay? So what happens? Sensory impulses travel to the vomiting center, and this vomiting center is also called the emetic center, E-M-E-T-I-C, emetic center of the medulla oblongata. And it leads to certain motor responses, like what? You start breathing deeply. The soft palate raises to close the nasopharynx. Very important, you have the closing of the opening of trachea. The trachea has to be closed. You don't want food going in there. The esophageal sphincter of the stomach, this sphincter, it will open, right? The diaphragm will contract to press down on the stomach. You start breathing deeply. You want to throw its contents out through the mouth. Abdominal muscles contract to increase pressure in the abdominal cavity. So all these motor responses will take place so that vomiting can occur. Motion sickness, vomiting can also occur because of rapid changes in the body. And usually the sensory impulses are sent from the inner ear for the balance, remember? And so when the body is changing, the positions of the body is changing because of motion, what happens is the message cannot be sent fast enough, and it results in vomiting. The important thing is, what does excessive vomiting result in? Excessive vomiting, of course, results in dehydration, nothing new. But what's important is it results also in disruption of body's electrolyte and acid-base balance. Very, very important. As you vomit, remember the stomach content has lots of hydrochloric acid, and that is lost. So what happens? The blood becomes alkaline. Why? Because the stomach is attempting to replace its lost hydrogen ions, and the stomach is going to absorb it from where? From the blood. So as a result, what happens is that you are going to have an acid-base imbalance. And with this we are done with the stomach. I thank you for listening to me, and I'll see you in class. Have a great day. Bye-bye.